English word that one hardly hears anymore, except in the confines of churches. And then in church, the concept of stewardship has become connected almost exclusively to the annual fundraising pledge campaign in support of the church budget. It's come to mean money. It's my hope to redeem that venerable word stewardship from the narrow and often negative confines of fundraising into which a powerful positive metaphor has been relegated. See, to be a steward is more than a matter of money. It's more than mere material concerns. To be a good and faithful steward is a unique role in society and is outlined by Jesus as a task or definition of his followers. To have at heart the attitudes and actions of a good steward is a gift that makes a person more Christ-like. Before I define the word steward, let me first remind you of that brief story. It was actually a parable of Jesus as recorded by Luke, read for us this morning by Patrick. Who is the faithful and wise steward? Jesus asked. The one whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time. That, in short, is the description of a steward. It's one who is set in charge of a household, of a family estate, of a business or a government. The one who's in charge of the economy of a group. And they are charged with the task to assure that all is managed fairly, fully, and in timely fashion. Jesus goes on to say, "Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Truly, I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant, on the other hand, says, my master is away, delayed, so he beats his fellow servants, eats and drinks with the drunkards, the master will return on a day when the servant does not expect him, at an hour that he does not know, and will punish him." That's kind of a scary story, the way Jesus tells it, because it's intended to warn his followers to be good stewards, fairly and fully managing the affairs of the one who is their Lord. Peter asked, is this just for us, or is this for everyone? The word steward, or stewardship, appears 26 times in the Bible, and it's uniformly a technical office. Namely, it's the one who has been given responsibility for the management of something that belongs to someone else. Jesus' story draws upon that very familiar biblical image. And usually the one to whom the steward is accountable is a royal official, a king, a ruler, a landlord. The first time we meet a steward in the Bible, it's in the final chapters of Genesis. He's an Egyptian official who is subject to Joseph, the Hebrew patriarch, who has risen in rank to Pharaoh's second in command. The steward represents his master in all affairs of state, much like we think a vice president would for a president, or like someone's intern would for their office staff. Just as Joseph himself in that story had been given authority to negotiate all matters in Pharaoh's name. In other words, it's a powerful position to be a steward. In the book of the Chronicles of David the king, stewards are given responsibility for the treasury, for vineyards, for herds and camels and flocks, for the whole of the Heifer International group. Stewards are named right along with the division commanders of the military and the chief counselors of the 12 tribes. They would be like cabinet-level officials in the government, or like directors of various departments in a corporation. In the book of Daniel, for example, the steward was the official who was charged with care and provisioning of the Hebrew prisoners of war, which included Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They were in charge of what were then the detention centers of the foreigners who had come into their country. The jail steward in that story could make decisions about Daniel's food, lodging, on the spot, without consulting any superiors, but he could not set them free. That's because the prisoners don't belong to him. He's just the steward. He's the warden, the sty warden, right? who cares for them. The one who cares for them, like a good shepherd, a good steward cares for the ones that are under his or her control. It was Isaiah the prophet who first drew upon the image of a steward as a metaphor. He referred to Shebna, who was the ruler of the inhabitants of Jerusalem in Isaiah's day. He called him a steward whose authority is about to be taken away and given to another for having brought shame on your master's house. By that, Isaiah meant Yahweh, God, the Lord, was the ultimate authority and owner of the people. And anybody who presumes to manage the affairs of God's people, anybody who assumes the mantle of the overlord, is in fact only a steward of what belongs to God. And as stewards, we represent God only so long as we see to the welfare of God's people with the same kind of heart and spirit and resources that God would do. When we fail to put the people's common good ahead of our own, when we think that it's really about us and about our power, we're finished. God can no longer use us. It's this prophetic metaphor of the steward as a servant of God who's been assigned authority by God for the purpose of seeing that all is managed fairly, fully, and in timely fashion for the flourishing of the household of God, that Jesus uses the metaphor for his followers, for his church. We are expected to be faithful and wise stewards, good managers, good treasurers, right? Good board of directors, good decision makers. As stewards of God's household, we, the disciples of Jesus, are responsible to look after the welfare of the other servants that are in the household with us. And you can use your imagination in your family or in your community or in the nation or in the world. Who are those people for whom we feel we are accountable and responsible? We stewards have a clearly defined task. We want to see to it that those who dwell with us in the household of God are properly fed, protected from thieves who would rob them of their treasures, and we are to stand watch over God's things. We've been deputized, so to speak, to carry out our tasks. We've been authorized to represent the interests of our Master, our Lord Jesus Christ. We are called, we are commissioned, we are cheered along in our duties, but we are also warned never to forget who we are and whose we are, lest we begin to think we are in charge, or that we are at liberty to do as we please with the others around us. We're free to consume all the resources God has placed in our hands. They're in our hands. After all, it's all ours. Now, maybe the steward is a notch higher in authority than the other maidservants or men servants in the household, but that extra authority bears with it extra responsibility. It's somewhat like a middle manager in a business, or a floor steward supervisor in a factory, or a department head in a school system. One is seen somewhat like an administrator, but somewhat like a faculty. Not fully one, not fully the other. To be a steward with responsibility from above is a hard place to be. You're kind of sandwiched between the ones you are serving and the ones you serve. Jesus' parable ends with this summary statement: everyone to whom much is given, much will be required. The one to whom men commit much, they demand all the more. When one is called or chosen to be a steward, it's both an honor and a burden. One must do right with the resources that are put in our hands. I'll mention about the Guidance Center. They're just now doing their September fundraiser, and so I got the mailing. When I first started there as the treasurer, it was a $1 million organization based at one of the local hospitals in Long Beach, and we did outplacement counseling for children. By the time I ended 22 years later, we were a $10 million organization in 30 of the schools, as well as 3 satellite offices where we saw inpatient care. So it was quite a change for the community. But you have to do the right thing with the resources that are invested in you for them to be trustworthy, as the Apostle Paul says. We are chosen. And we are blessed with abundant good things, not for our sakes, but on behalf of others whom we serve. And those are all others, whoever they may be. As stewards of God's universal grace, much has been given to us, and so much is required from us as well. Stewardship is, as I say in the title of this sermon, a matter of managing our resources. But actually, it's more correct to say stewardship is really our managing of God's resources placed in our control. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, all things are yours, whether the world or life, the present or the future, all is yours, and you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. We are all bound up with one another. Even Jesus Christ himself is part of that chain of mutuality. Even Jesus Christ is accountable as God's steward for the life and teachings that he lived. And Paul goes on to say, this is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. And moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found trustworthy. Jesus calls them faithful and wise servants. At the heart of this parable of faithful stewardship in Luke 12, Jesus says, and I quote, blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly, I say to you, the master will gird himself and have them sit at table, and he will come and serve them. What a remarkable reversal. No landlord of old, no royal officer, no civic leader would ever think to serve his servants. Right? They eat in the other room at a different time after they've fed the master, right? But that is the core of Jesus' expression of God. That surprising